Hi, and welcome back. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at vector-based graphics. And we're going to be looking at a few different things. We'll starting off with just basic definitions, getting into the technical side about what the term means, as well as looking at some of the artists that are associated with different types of movements that utilize these types of graphics or method of creating imagery. We'll be looking at things like a little bit about typography, as well as understanding how art fits into the mix of working with vector imagery. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. The first thing that you want to know about this is that vectors are a type of imagery that are computer generated. To give you an exact definition, they're computer graphics created with mathematical programming to make interconnected lines, points, or anchors and paths. Now, let me throw that all out there again. Vectors are a computer graphic created with mathematical programming to make interconnected lines, points, or anchors and paths. Now, what does that all mean visually? So what you can if you can get a picture of it, the idea is a line that essentially comes out of a single point and extends out from it across to another point. That is called a basic line or a basic pathway for a vector line to draw with on the computer screen. And so each of those points actually hold information inside of them to tell you how that line extends out and arrives at the other one, or at the other point. The line could come out going in an arc. It could go straight across. It could start to arc a lot and then suddenly dip and roll into the next point. All of those things are what occur inside of programming for vector graphics. Now obviously, this behaves differently than what we experienced with Photoshop and with pixel-based graphics, right? The key things we understand about pixel-based graphics, let's kind of look at some of the comparisons, like what makes a vector different than a pixel-based image. So first off, a couple things to know. Vectors are points connected by lines. Raster images are many individual color pixels, right? Like that's the color pixel grid that we talked about. Vectors are resolution independent. That means they work without the problems of a resolution level being set on the screen. And if we remember with pixels, the opposite side of that is that they have to have a resolution setting. They are dependent on it because they are blocks of pixels. So remember, the more pixels you get, the better the image is. Well, vectors, it just doesn't work that way. They don't need the quality setting, so they are infinitely scalable. Vectors also create a smaller file size than pixel-based images do. That's because there's not as much data to store in the file to tell it how to draw the image. Vectors make line art graphic images with simple colors or gradients. Again, these are much like the sort of graphic logos we see online. A lot of imagery that we see that go into ad campaigns, marketing, web design, all of those things. Raster images, as we recall, they create photorealistic images with rich color and detail. And you can't really get that with vectors per se. Vectors are very flat in a sense, so they're very much like illustrations rather than like rich detail photographs. So there's not lots of like teeny tiny changes of shade that change as the image, as we progress looking through the image. Vectors have lines and then they have fill colors essentially. Another thing that's interesting about vectors is that they are, again, infinitely zoomable for detail, where raster or pixel images have a max level of zoom that they can assume to be able to see details. Remember, the closer we get to a photographic digital image, the worse off that image really looks. But with a vector, you can keep blowing it up and shrinking in on it and zooming in, and it will always look clean. So that's kind of an idea to help you understand the difference between a vector image process and a pixel-based image process. Some of the formats that you'll find common with vector graphics, one of them we'll be working with is the Adobe Illustrator format, AI for short, and that is the native file format in Illustrator that we'll use for saving layers, editing data, color information, basically everything. And that keeps all of your vector graphics in line in that software. There are also SVG graphics is also another format common with vectors. That's called a scalable vector graphic. It's very common to find those with websites today in generating designs that can be seen on a web page, whether they are, and often they are interactive, but they make great imagery with those, high detail keeping. EPS is also another format that's vector-based, and that's called the Encapsulated PostScript. It's much older, one of the earlier formats, and it's also very common across the board in vector software that you can find. So again, it just stores the same kind of data, like line structures, where the anchor points are located, and the colors associated with them. So those are some of the formats associated with vector-based design. Some of the applications that you can find that the industry, the world works with vectors in include everything from logo design to web design to 3D graphics, oddly enough. TrueType fonts, TT fonts, are also a type of vector-based imagery that the computer recognizes. Packaging design is a great example of use of vector graphics. So are, again, if you see ad campaigns, they are multiplied through all kinds of different production materials, from headline materials, stamps, business cards, letterheads, billboards, all of that stuff. And you can also find industrial design materials also use vectors to help understand the shape of the material for machines to cut and create from. So CNC machines, laser cutters, all of those things work out of systems of looking at vector-based imagery for precision and for scaling. So that gives you kind of an idea of some of the applications you can find that work with vector-based graphics. Now, as you recall, like with this particular project, again, you're working with graphics to create an illustrated image that contains imagery and text, specifically informational text. So another key component in this project is looking at things like typography. Well, what does that fancy term really mean? Typography is just the study of language, or words, as it were, characters, character forms and words that you can find. That's kind of a basic idea of what typography is. When you're working with it inside of a format like we will, you're working with text and form and imagery together to bring kind of this beautiful marriage of image and text into the same place to help make sense of a concept. And really to creatively visualize information. Some of the greatest posters that are out there that are, again, for campaigns for like bringing awareness to a social issue are a great example. And they're very well designed and visually enhanced in such a way that they allow you to see the idea of what's going on. So there may be hidden imagery, or words may be constructed into the shape of a drawn form or a person or a thing. We've seen a lot of that. But that's just to name a few things of what you can do with typography as part of a design element in this project. Typography is a key component you'll look at as you go forward. But again, as you work with type, you're looking at letter forms. There are many documents that I've linked inside of Blackboard related to working with typography. So feel free to read over those and take a look at those. To kind of understand that everything type related has a purpose when it's in design and used for design. Specific font faces are used to carry a certain emotion. There are certain kinds that are used in order for you to just be able to read them, like on a web page. You don't just use scripty text on everything or Comic Sans on everything. Everything has its place and purpose when it's used in design to help communicate a message clearly. So that kind of just gives you a few ideas of how type is used and how it's understood. But again, in terms of working with vectors, again, that's another element that can be controlled by vector-based graphics. Now, some of the artists that are associated with this movement will include people like, historically speaking, people like Saul Bass, Paul Rand, Paula Scher, Josef Muller-Brockmann, Jan Tischelt, Alvin Lustig, and Aaron Draplin, just to name a few. Obviously, you can get a lot of ideas by going out there and looking around to see what's being created right now with digital illustration.